is, I think, the oldest book here. It's one of the first Something Else Press books. Robert Filiou was in New York, and I wanted to do a book with him. And we got the idea of doing a book which would have stupid questions that have serious answers. That was the criterion. And not all of these questions were made by Filiou. He found a couple of them in newspapers, and he invited some of his friends to give him a good question that was of that sort. But you'll never be able to tell which was which. And the original format of this, these questions were on postcards. And this is a book which collected all the postcards. I'm also very happy with my book design for this. I designed the cloth. That cloth is a Dick Higgins design. This is a book by Danielle Spurry, The Anecdoted Topography of Chance. One day he had a fight with his girlfriend Kishka, and she stormed out of the apartment. And he was left with his breakfast table. And this is what was on his breakfast table. You see it's in larger form here. And he picked up the objects one by one and asked himself, what do these objects mean to me? Oh, this is a bottle top from a bottle of wine that Kishka and I enjoyed yesterday, and so on. And that made a very interesting catalog for an exhibition he was doing in France. But I thought it would be nice to do it in English, and he said, sure, that's fine, and my friend Emmett Williams will translate it. Well, Emmett started to translate it, and Danielle got thinking about the objects, and he said, no, the wine bottle was not yesterday, it was the day before yesterday. And then Emmett made a footnote and said, no, it wasn't the day before yesterday, it was last week. And you enjoyed it with your friend Adi Kupka, who was visiting from Denmark. So then he put a footnote, Adi Kupka. I first met Adi Kupka in 1959, and so it just sort of expands. And so some of these have extremely complex series of notes. Here, for example, we have a gold-colored package, and it contains condoms, or used to contain condoms, and it tells what's on the thing. Then there's the translator's note. Then there's the author's additional note, and another author additional note, and a whole dialogue between the author and the translator, Emmett, and so on. So this is a good book to use as a portrait of Paris at that time, because this, on the serious level, apart from the fantasy of it all, it becomes a portrait of Spurry and the circle around the Nouveau Realiste in Paris in the early 60s. Now, Emmett Williams was the second editor at Something Else Press. The first editor was Barbara Moore, who's now a Fluxus critic, and she worked with me on this. But Emmett Williams was the editor who worked on this book, and he was not only one of the original people with Fluxus, but also in concrete poetry. And I said, concrete poetry is hardly known in the United States. I would like to do a good anthology with you. So he produced this anthology. I did all the designs in here. I had done some concrete poems myself, but I left myself out of the anthology in order to create a precedent so that it would never be complete. If you look at the back of this, it has an interesting remark. It says, to be continued. And the reason for that was that Emmett and I talked about having a historic section, visual poetry from the Dadaists and the Futurists and before. And finally he said, no, we should focus specifically on the 1950s and 60s. So this is all 1950s and 60s. But I thought, well, I will make another book that comes after this with the old visual poetry, and that became eventually my big book on pattern poetry in Hungarian Képviselő. And that is in the Széchenyi Library, the National Széchenyi Library. You can see a copy of it. And there are others who have copies of it also. And as for an anthology since, it just didn't happen, but there was one on experimental prose that Richard Kostelanetz did that's a little bit similar. This is a cross-section of my poetry, and some of my work is pure poetry, some of it is sound poetry, some is visual in one way or another, and you can look at that at your leisure. This is a catalog from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which John Hendricks sent to you. It was curated by Clive Philpott and put together by John. You should open it.
So John Hendricks küldte, ugye?
Another of the very early Something Else Press books was this book of Ray Johnson's. Ray Johnson was one of the originators of mail art, which became very important here in Eastern Europe, so that the artists could network to each other. And this is the way we did it. At the time, we could hardly afford the postage. Nobody had any money. But we had all kinds of ideas of little artwork that we would like to do and send through the mail. And so the early American version of it in the 1956 through 63 maybe was much more aesthetic than what it became elsewhere, where it was more political or philosophical. We got that too, but that wasn't until the late 60s. But these are all pieces which came to me through the mail from Ray Johnson. So it's really a Ray Johnson book of things which were sent to Dick Higgins. You'll see that some of the things which are in here are addressed to someone else, but he sent me a carbon copy. This is a book by Allison, and it has, besides the text, the images here are worth mentioning. She was invited to do a book at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York. Now, in the same city is the headquarters of the Xerox company. And the people from the Visual Studies Workshop needed a good Xerox machine, and Xerox offered to donate them a machine, any one they wanted that Xerox made. So they went there, and Xerox thought for sure they would choose one of these great, big, automatic machines. They didn't. They chose one of the oldest Xerox machines. Why? Because it has a rheostat on it with which you can adjust the electrical current, which means it will be a little bit black or very black. It goes to absolute extremes. And this book could have been made only that way, with low voltage, for example, this very pale image and things like that. So Xerox was horrified, but gave them the machine. And it's still there, and all the students just love it, because it's like an automatic camera compared with a camera which you can control. If you can control the camera, you lose a little in speed, but you get a better picture. And so it is with the old Xerox machines. I was at one point doing Zen meditation, although I've never been a Buddhist. And one of the most important Zen texts is the Sin Sin Ming by the sixth Zen patriarch, King San. So I was exposed to this text, and it didn't feel right. Now, years before, a friend of mine in Germany had translated it and had published it eventually with Irmelin Lebeer, who's a friend of Allison's, in a rather beautiful edition. And their translation is much better than the official translation that we had. So I took my friend's translation and I wrote commentaries on it, the way the Buddhists historically have. But my commentaries are extensions of it into poetry and relating in a lyrical way and an intuitive way to the text that they have here. I read this on Thursday, so you've heard me read it aloud. But the best way to read this is, say you're reading section 33. 33, then you start here and then you go here. Then 34, you start here and you go here, and so on. And this is a book of poems by a friend of mine with whom I'm working. He's published some things by Allison, and he operates as left-hand books. His name is Brian McHugh, and his poems are dictated by our cat. And the cat's name is Rio. It was once upon a time Hana's cat. And that's the fantasy. He uses Rio as a kind of, not so much pen name as a mask, because the character that he creates is the character that he sees in Rio at this time. So these are poems of Rio the cat, and I thought that would be a nice extra thing for you to have in your archive.